Hello, peace lovers and peacemakers. This is Sara Jamshidi. You are watching and listening to Peace Mindedly, a podcast program where I feature peaceful bridge makers. Before we dive into the program and just go further, I really have one request, and that is when you are we are streaming live, and you are more than welcome to post your comments, your suggestions, your questions, and my beautiful guest, who is a scholar, and I'm going to talk about my guest in details, is going to do her best to answer the questions. But I really would like us to be mindful and also peaceful about the comments that we are making in the comment box today on the program. So, and then the other request I have is, if I can go here. Yes, I would like you to please write me back your feedback, the suggestions, comments, questions you would like to mention to me. So then I be considering them and being mindful about them. I really want to get your feedback and your suggestions and comments. It's at editor@goldtune.com. Goldtune.com is a website I manage with a group of international correspondents. And then editor, I receive this email when you send me out your questions, your comments, your feedback. So yes, for this hour, we are talking with Denari Duffner. Jordan is an author and scholar of Muslim-Christian relations, interreligious dialogue, and Islamophobia. Her award-winning book, Finding Jesus Among Muslims: How Loving Islam Makes Me a Better Catholic, explores options for peace and understanding between cultures and religions. Jordan is known for her work studying and combating anti-Muslim bigotry with the Bridge Initiative, a research project on Islamophobia housed in Georgetown University. She first started as a research fellow and now serves as an advisory assistant. Today is particularly an interesting and very important day to talk about Jordan's work, because today is the National Anti-Terrorism Day in the United States. I am welcoming Denari Duffner. Hi, Jordan.
Hello, great to be with you.
Excellent. Great to have you here. Thank you so much. Okay, Jordan. So today is the National Anti-Terrorism Day. You know, the phrase itself and the way it has been pointed out makes me myself as a Muslim, makes me nervous, makes me to have goosebumps, makes me to feel sort of sick in my stomach, and makes me feel that, oh my God, so perhaps they are celebrating of not having me as person in this country. So it's a very sort of, if I'm starting it personal, but for me, especially this day is really disheartening. And then I just wanted to see what you think about today and announcing this particular day as Anti-Terrorism Day.
Well, I was actually surprised to hear about the day. I hadn't really been familiar with it before, but I had the same reaction that you did when I first heard about it, because in our public discourse here in the United States, but also around the world, terrorism has been linked with Muslims. It's been linked with Islam, and so just in the minds of ordinary Americans who are not Muslim, hearing that word terrorism might bring Muslims to mind. And yeah, it's concerning. And it asks this question: who are we talking about when we're saying anti-terrorism? Is it all types of terrorism or just certain kinds? And is that leading us to maybe scapegoat a group of people that we shouldn't be?
So are we doing scapegoat of a group of people that is perhaps suggested here?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we see the scapegoating of Muslims in a lot of different realms in public life. At the same time, I've been so heartened in recent years the ways that people of all different faith communities are rallying together and standing up for one another. I mean, we've seen so many instances of the targeting of religious communities, whether they be Muslims, Jews, Sikhs, Christians, and others. So I hope that those bonds of solidarity can win out over this sort of subtle scapegoating that we might be doing in our discourse.
Mm-hmm. So why is it even necessary, in your opinion, as a young scholar and PhD student? Why do you think, and researcher, is important to address this particular issue
of Islamophobia?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's for me as a Christian, there's a moral component to this. For me as a Christian, I'm taught to love God through my love of neighbor. And when we see people targeted for who they are, whether it's the color of their skin or the religious tradition that they're affiliated with, that is a problem and something that we need to address, regardless of whether or not it directly harms us. So for me as a Catholic and Christian person, it's important on a moral level to respond to those sorts of things. And I think people from lots of different communities would have a similar response, that even when I'm not the one targeted, we need to confront injustice whenever we can.
And then by trying to confront injustice the way you can, you decided to write a book about that.
Yes, I had the great opportunity to publish this book, Finding Jesus Among Muslims, with a Catholic publishing company, which really meant a lot to me because I had done a lot of research with the Bridge Initiative on the resources and the books that were out there for Catholics about Islam. And there are some really great books out there, but a lot of them weren't selling very well. And then there were also books that, to go back to this point about scapegoating, cast Muslims in a negative light, perhaps spread misinformation and misunderstanding about Muslims. And so it was really, I felt very fortunate to be able to put my experiences out there and to hopefully push back against some of the unwarranted negativity towards Muslims that sometimes occurs in my own faith community.
Jordan, it's all about you, and it's all about personal stories. So how come you decided that this is the route you would like to take, to talk about yourself, and you put yourself out there to explain things that matters to you?
Well, I think sharing our stories is a great way to connect with other people. And also, I had met so many wonderful Muslim individuals in my course of study, in my time in college, and my time living abroad in the Middle East. And I wanted my own Catholic faith community to get a chance to meet a lot of those people, and to also hear about my experience and the way that interreligious dialogue with Muslims impacted my faith life and my relationship with God in a positive way. I think.
How did it impact it? How?
I mean, there's so much I could say, of course. But for me, I think sometimes there's this assumption that engaging with people of other faiths can take you one of two directions. Either you learn about a tradition and you really like it and you convert, or you encounter another tradition and you really don't like it, and then you remain in the place where you are. The experience that I had was that I came to really love what I found in the Muslim community, love what I learned about the Islamic tradition, but also found myself in that admiration, also finding things in my own Catholic faith that I wanted to hold on to, and that I also grew to appreciate. Sometimes the way I put it is, seeing the beauty in Islam helped me to recognize some of the beauty in my own Catholic tradition.
Give me a specific examples. I want specific examples.
Sure. So there was one occasion when I was in college, when I went on a Muslim prayer retreat with the local Muslim Students Association. And I went to Georgetown, which is a Catholic university. So we're fairly unique in that we are a Catholic school, but we have faith activities for other religious groups. And I was kind of interested to go on the Muslim retreat. I was still identifying as Catholic at the time, but interested to learn more about other religions. And our imam said, "Come along, we'd love to have you." And I was praying. We were doing a sort of extended session of Salah, or Muslim prayer, in the evening, and they welcomed me to join in, which was wonderful. And as I was standing there, and a part of this prayer tradition that's not my own, I realized that I had this desire to not hold my hands in the way that Muslims might, sort of like on their stomach or like on their sides, but to actually fold my hands in the way that I'd grown up doing. And it was this moment where being a part of this other faith community, or having this immersion into another tradition, helped me to appreciate what I'd grown up with. Because at that time, I was not really sure I wanted to be Catholic anymore. And the hospitality that I experienced with Muslims, these experiences in prayer, helped me also to appreciate what I had in my own tradition.
So when you said that in the interfaith dialogue, or in any kind of dialogue that we have between different religions. So two things happen. One of the things that may happen is that you probably just convince the other person and they convert.
I mean, sometimes that happens, right?
But here's the thing. So what is it about dialogue and discussion and winning over the reasoning that we feel we whether need to protect ourselves against the idea that is coming at us, or keep reasoning so then we win over the dialogue, if that makes sense? So what this kind of reasoning and intellectual interaction do produce that makes us to be too mindful about our discussions?
So, I think I should clarify that for me, the purpose of interreligious dialogue, people should never go into dialogue anticipating that they're going to try to convert someone. We as Christians and Muslims, hoping that people become a part of your faith tradition is a pretty important part. In the Christian tradition, we sometimes talk about that as evangelization, but for Catholics, evangelization means something bigger, that includes a kind of dialogue that isn't intent on people, that you convincing someone to become Christian. So the way I think about dialogue is not necessarily this sort of debate or competition that goes on, but rather this common search for truth that we take together. In the book, I talk about this metaphor for dialogue that I really love. And I'll tell a little story to illustrate it. So back in the 1990s, there was a Catholic priest who was living in Algeria, along with a bunch of other monks. I think there were about 10 monks living in a monastery in Algeria. And Father Christian, the head of this group, he had a close relationship with a Muslim friend named Muhammad in the neighborhood, and they would often get together and talk about faith and just hang out. And they called it digging their well. That was the metaphor that they used. And one day, one day, Muhammad came by and he would say, "Okay, Father, are you ready to go dig our well?" And Father Christian, he sort of had I guess maybe an attitude that day. And he said, "Well, what do you think we're going to find at the bottom of our well? Is it going to be Christian water, or is it going to be Muslim water?" And Muhammad replied and he said, "You know better than that. It's God's water. It doesn't belong to either of us." And so for me, that's how I see dialogue. It's this common task that we undertake that has God at the center. And it's not necessarily about either party converting or trying to convert the other, but rather this joint conversion that happens, that within our religious traditions, we both can grow closer to God. And that's what my experience has been. I haven't changed my religious affiliation in dialogue with Muslims, but I hope and I think that those relationships and friendships have led to myself and those I spend time with, growing closer to God.
So are we trying to include so many people, or every person in this kind of dialogue?
So in a sense, yes. In that this is not a kind of dialogue that necessarily has to be scheduled on the calendar. I think this sort of dialogue, the Catholic Church talks about it as the dialogue of life. It's simply living alongside people who are different from us, whoever we happen to come into contact with, sharing our joys and our sorrows. That's some of Pope Francis's favorite language. And so, it's not about checking all the boxes. Have I done my dialogue with my Jewish friend, with my Muslim friend, with my Hindu friend? But I think it's about being present to the people that are around us and in our lives, and living out this dialogical relationship in that way.
Who are we living out? So this is my problem in the interfaith discussion. So they keep talking about this Abrahamic, traditions and people who has been believed in. This specifically three specific traditions from Abraham, and then I keep thinking we are leaving out almost half of the world who are not in the Abrahamic religion, and then they are not believe even in God. So why do we when we say interreligious or when we say interfaith, why are we not including those people who are not believing in God?
Well, it's a good question. I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I think part of the reason is that certain religions, for better or for worse, have been labeled major religions, and then others get left out, even though they might say have larger numbers than some that we consider part of the in-group. I think in terms of the inclusion of people who don't believe in God, it's sometimes a matter of how these things are framed. When we say interreligious dialogue, we're assuming sometimes that everyone has some sort of belief in God. I don't know if the terminology needs to change in order to include other people who don't believe in God. That probably is the case. That being said, I think even within even among those who do profess a belief in God or the same God, there's still so much opportunity for conversation and learning. And, so I still think it's valuable, even when we can't reach everyone in one setting, to still do some of this one-on-one or other forms of dialogue that unfortunately can't include everyone, but are still can have some fruitful outcomes and improving understanding and going on this journey, to God, so to speak.
Yes. I'm going to change the gear and I'm going to focus on Islamophobia. Then we are going to come back to your book and more specific about the examples and stories. But on Islamophobia, what did you find in your research that really, really bothered you?
So I was working full-time at the Bridge Initiative from basically during the Trump election, or I should say the 2016 election campaign, which was very much dominated by the campaign of President Trump and others. And the thing that troubled me the most was that anti-Muslim groups that we had been tracking, and I had, even before I worked at the Bridge Initiative, been reading about and tracking for a long time, that were fringe groups. They were, maybe involved in Republican politics or, having an impact in some ways in the American, public sphere. These people started to be tapped as advisors to the political campaigns on the Republican side. And then when the Trump administration came into power, some of the top people had worked directly for anti-Muslim groups or had won awards from anti-Muslim groups or had collaborated and worked with them in some way. And so this was really scary that Islamophobia has long been a problem in American politics, whether it was latent or more subtle or more explicit. But we have never seen something like this, where people who are a part of anti-Muslim hate groups are advising the presidential administration on different matters of policy. And so it's no surprise that we saw things like the Muslim ban. These are the sorts of things that these anti-Muslim groups had been wanting to see for a long time. So that for me was really troubling.
Is it going to get better if we have the same administration?
So I will say that some of the individuals that actually many of those particular individuals who I was initially concerned about have since left the administration, but that does not mean that there aren't still folks who share those views. So, I mean, I hope there are ways that the administration can change ideologically. I just don't see it happening. I mean, I know there are people pushing for change in big and small ways inside and outside the administration, but I I haven't seen. I think the reason why we haven't heard as much of the blatantly Islamophobic rhetoric recently from the administration, we have heard some, but is because we're not in a frenzied election situation or run up right now. I mean, we are moving in that direction now in 2020, but with COVID-19, it's been different. But I do worry as we get closer to the election that a lot of the anti-Muslim rhetoric and then eventual policies are going to ramp up again.
So it's going to happen because it sells. It's going to happen because it gets the ratings. So it's going to happen for why? What reason?
Oh, I think financial for sure. I think there are individuals who benefit financially off of scapegoating people. One of the things I really appreciate about Pope Francis is he constantly is talking about the arms trade, and the way when he talks about misunderstanding between religious groups or groups from different countries, he oftentimes brings up the issues of the arms trade and war and the ways that fueling conflict and ideological conflict between people makes other people money and fuels fuels conflicts around the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's part of it. I also think it wins people political points, of course. I mean, in the 2016 election campaign, when Ben Carson, Ted Cruz, and Donald Trump each had their surges in the polls, it was a direct result of anti-Muslim comments that they made that appealed to their base. So it's all of those things. I think, of course, there are people, I think the vast majority of the American public, say, who they are not intentionally anti-Muslim in a way where they know they're getting something out of it or they're not getting something tangible out of it. But I think in terms of these movers and shakers and people in politics, they definitely benefit in tangible ways from promoting bigotry.
We do have other religious minorities, like Jewish minorities. So why there is no attack against the Jewish minorities, and why they cannot make the bucks out of attacking that minority group, do you think?
Well, I actually think the Jewish community has been at the receiving end of a considerable amount of discrimination and scapegoating, particularly since 2016. Hate crimes against Jews in the United States have far exceeded anti-Muslim hate crimes within the past few years. So it's definitely a big problem. And even though in mainstream political discourse, you don't hear as much scapegoating of Jewish Americans, we are hearing it more and more on the fringes or in popular discourse. I recently have been on social media and seen some of the anti-Semitic signs or messages that people are holding up at some of these protests against some of the measures that governments are taking with COVID-19, basically blaming Jews for what's going on, which is a horrid and longstanding anti-Jewish trope to blame Jews for health crises or plagues or things like that.
What would be the gain if they do that? So what would be the gain to blame Jewish community?
I think it does win people political points in a certain sphere and things like that. Absolutely. I'm not as well versed on that, so I don't want to speak too much on it. But like with anything, when there is a group to scapegoat, that we can blame for our problems and then kind of move on, there are people that are going to benefit from that.
Absolutely. So in your book, there are not only stories, but also some of the suggestions that we could do to address this particular issue of dealing with people that we do not know, and then how to broaden our own perspective about the other group. So what are those suggestions?
So I think one suggestion that I would have is for people to really grapple with the stereotypes that they hold on to about people of another faith tradition. I think first you have to learn what those stereotypes are. So that's important. But then to seriously reflect inwardly on, am I holding on to these biases and stereotypes? When I was living and studying abroad in the country of Jordan, I was one afternoon doing my Arabic homework, and I was living with a host family at the time, so I was in an ordinary neighborhood, and I was sitting there doing my homework, and I heard outside this man yelling very loudly in the street. He was yelling out of a megaphone in Arabic. He sounded very sort of angry and emphatic in what he was saying. He was speaking in a very rushed way, and I, at the time, didn't know the dialect of Arabic spoken in Jordan very well, so I had a hard time hearing, and it was sort of garbled. But it sort of worried me because I thought, oh, who is this? And this was during the Arab Spring period, and so I wondered, is this person trying to rile people up to, topple the government or something? What is going on? I had all of these things running through my mind, all of these sort of stereotypical worries. And so I asked my host mother, who was walking by my bedroom, I said, who is that man outside? Who is that speaking? And she said, oh, that's just a guy selling fruit out of the back of his truck, selling produce. And I was so embarrassed that I had immediately jumped to this kind of stereotypical assumption about the person outside the window. I had, by that point in my studying and my career, I was already really familiar with the stereotypes that exist about Muslims and Arabs, and actively was trying to help my community overcome them. And then in that moment, I was confronted with my own bias that, I couldn't have imagined that someone would be yelling about something as innocuous as bananas and zucchinis and tomatoes and all of those things. And instead, I immediately jumped to what was most stereotypical. And so I bring that up and I tell that story because it shows that whatever good intentions we have, we may think of ourselves, as peacemakers, as your show kind of puts forward, but we all have these, stereotypes. And so we have to be really vigilant and constantly be working on them in ourselves, because only then are we going to be able to affect things beyond ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. Like this stereotype that I just had about the Jewish community, and I just learned that they are. I mean, I know that they are suffering. I have a ton of very close Jewish friends, but to know that actually it's the very important fact and issue is a stereotypical mindset that goes into my viewing the a perspective. But what are your stereotypes against? I mean, if you can just number a few of them about, Islam, or about Jewish community, or about, this particular, or about Catholic faith, that you think it is a stereotypical belief that I do have.
Sure. So I guess to start with some stereotypes about Muslims, the most common one, to go back to the terrorism point that you made earlier, this idea that Muslims are inherently violent and that their religion promotes violence. That's probably the most common stereotype. You also have the stereotype that Islam is oppressive to women. And so there's this assumption of misogyny on the part of Muslim men, and this submissiveness that of Muslim women. You also have the stereotype of Muslims wanting to impose some sort of foreign law on the United States. We heard a few years ago all of this chatter about, Muslims wanting to bring Sharia law to America, as if Sharia is this single legal system that is, unanimously horrible, whereas Sharia and Islamic jurisprudence is a lot more diverse and complicated than that. And so what I find sort of not ironic, but about these stereotypes, but illuminating, is that they were also believed to characterize American Catholics in previous generations. So when my great-grandparents from Italy, for example, were coming to the United States, a few generations ago, Catholics were seen as unanimously anti-woman, and trying to impose this sort of foreign papist law on the United States, that we were, engaging in these machinations to try to, infiltrate the government and overthrow the Constitution. So the thing I always point out to people is the way that these stereotypes just get recycled and recycled and recycled to target whoever is the easiest community to scapegoat at the time, or the newest community on our shores, or those sorts of things. So those are just some examples.
So aren't some of those stereotypes are actually based on some of the some facts and realities? I mean, just going back, probably I can say because I am Muslim, but we do have laws, at least in Iran that I know, that is just so much against women. And then, but I think the point here that and then women are oppressed. So in a way that it's true. But I think the point that we are missing to make is, yes, there are so many of those wrongdoings or wrong things that exist within the community, but there's also so many solutions and so many actions against those wrongdoings that we are not talking about.
Absolutely.
And then I think that is one of the major issues. For instance, I can talk with definite very, very, very determined facts about Iran and about the United States. And I know that the women's movement in Iran is very, very strong, but we do not cover and we do not talk about that. So therefore, we're just talking about that particular. Yeah, very good. So so the stereotype against Catholics you mentioned, about Muslims you mentioned, and is there any kind of stereotype about Jewish people? I always think that there are some very positive stereotypes. For instance, I always think that Jewish people are very clever, always very well educated, or they are they understand finance really well. So there are also sometimes positive stereotypes about the community.
So those, in a sense, have a positivity to them. At the same time, though, they've been used to claim that Jews are trying to secretly take over things, right? Sort of like the example that I mentioned with Catholics too. So I think we have to be really careful about those sorts of stereotypes, because they are used to, one, they're, again, a generalization. They're not something that's actually representative of that community. And two, they've going back into, European history and beyond, have been used to say, oh, well, look at that community there.
So what we can do to address or fight against stereotypes?
I think, one, it's letting people know that those are stereotypes and that they're not reflections of reality. And one of the ways that will happen is through interpersonal dialogue. But it's also about education on sort of a more mass kind of level, and giving people the tools to recognize these stereotypes, right? So I think that's really important. And to also point out, as we've talked about before, the interests that benefit from us labeling groups in a certain way, and that can see. Yeah, I just think that's got to be part of it too.
Excellent. So stay with me, Jordan. You are listening to Peace Mindedly, as well as you are watching to Peace Mindedly, a podcast show where I feature peaceful bridge makers. I feature this podcast show every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2:30. I'm moving to 12:30 time bracket because of some technical issues that I have. It's starting in June, but for the next week particularly, I am featuring again at 2:30 Tuesday and Thursday. For Tuesday, I have a very special guest, Julia Baca, filmmaker. She is working on her recent movie about injustice, and also Michelle Garrett. She is the peace builder and peacemaker of and traveling around the world and just doing great work. So we are going to talk about her book, and we're going to talk about how she actually builds peace among communities and within different cultures and nations. So you can, the same program is available here on live, and then it's going to be available on YouTube channel. The edited version, the audio edited version of the program is going to be on many different podcast programs, podcast platforms. It's going to be on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, and many other podcasts. Please do subscribe to when you listen to Peace Mindedly and to my guests. So what else can I tell you? In this hour, we are talking with a special guest, Jordan Denari Duffner, author, scholar, and PhD student at Georgetown University. So, I am learning a lot from Jordan about how to fight against my own stereotype and how we are labeling other communities and other cultures for some particular benefits. So, Jordan, I wanted to just read a few of the numbers that I've prepared for this show, and I want to get your reaction. It's about terrorism and Islamophobia. So here's the issue. It's been said that the United States is under threat of these Muslims are coming over and trying to take over and to kill us and so forth and so on. But here are the numbers. So according to the research, the number of terrorist victims in the United States is minuscule. Okay, so for the context, 30,208 Americans died from fall. 38,000 more, 38.8 thousand from poisoning, and 33.8 thousand from motor vehicle death, and only 88 people total. And that numbers were from only 1 year, but total death from year 2001 until 2015, and that includes San Bernardino terrorist attack. So and then here's the fact: the expense of war against ISIS from August 2014 until July 2015, less than 1 year, was $2.74 billion, about 9.1 million a day. So, marketing of the war and selling the war, I think it just shows here with the numbers that we are, and here's the U.S. government National Terrorism Center said that in case where the religious affiliations of terrorist casualties could be determined, Muslim suffered between 82 to 97% of the terrorist-related fatalities over the past 5 years. So here's the thing. We are talking about, Muslims are coming and they're going to take over and they're going to kill us. But in fact, it's just very minimal death of the terrorist attack in the United States. So why I think we touched based on that because of political issues and government issues and so forth and so on. But I'm still so fascinated to see. So what is the real reasoning behind many of those propaganda, perhaps?
It's it's hard to say, and you make some you pointed out some really striking details and statistics about casualties from certain types of violence. I think for me, the thing that's really important to think about, and that I encourage people to think about more often, is what types of violence are we labeling terrorism, and what types of violence are we not labeling terrorism. I think it's only really been since the shooting at the Black church in South Carolina that we have started to use the word terrorism not describe or to describe forms of violence that have not been committed by Muslims. Up until that point in the United States, I think the word terrorism basically equaled supposed Muslim perpetrator and or violence that was committed, by someone out of some sort of Islamic religious conviction or something. We have started to see a bit of a shift in using that word in a I think a more accurate and fair way, to not just use it to talk about people who are committing violence out of a particular ideology or from a particular religious background. So I think that's something to think about. I think you also pointed out the numbers of victims of groups like ISIS or others in parts of the Middle East. And you're right that the vast majority of these people are Muslim. And of course, you have people of other religious communities, including Christians, who are the victims there as well. But I think, unfortunately, in this country, the narrative often is it's Muslims who are the aggressors and we who are the victims. When I think, obviously, the statistics show that it's a lot more complicated than that. And so the important thing, as you mentioned before, is to complicate that narrative and to show forth all the ways that those stereotypes and that clash of civilizations narrative isn't true.
Are we listening? Have you seen in your experience that people are paying attention? I think in the beginning of the program, you just mentioned that it's interfaith dialogue and in this talking within the communities and so forth has helped tremendously. So I think we are listening, aren't we?
I think there are real improvements that are happening. I've seen them in my own faith community. I've been really heartened by the ways that Catholics have stepped up to the plate in certain respects. I think we have a long way to go. But I think people are learning. I've had when I go around and do talks about my book, I've had folks come up to me and say that they've actually recognized their own biases or stereotypes and that they're working on letting those go. Or I had a young man come up to me recently after a talk, and he said, I have Muslim friends, but I always, like, in the back of my head had this concern about them and wondering, like, if they were really, like, okay, like, was it really okay to, like, trust them, or had about them. And he said, and I realized that I need to let that go. And so I think people really are they're trying, and that doesn't mean that everything's going to be rosy, but I'm seeing signs of hope, even as things still are bleak in some respects.
Yes, I'm trying to find a passage in your book that you said you felt. Yes, there you go. You felt that it's your religious duty to just speak up and to address the issue. So how come it's again my own stereotype. I'm sorry, but so how come it's a religious duty? So how specifically in the Catholic faith has been addressed that you need to stand up for someone else?
There's, again, a million examples I could give. But one of the things that I draw on often is the ways that Jesus in his own time dealt with religious others, people who were not of his own faith community. We have in the Bible, in the Gospel of Luke, I believe, the story of the Good Samaritan, and the basic. I won't tell the whole story, but the Samaritan was not a member of Jesus's own faith community, but he was heralded in this story as being as being the good guy, as being the one who actually fulfilled the religious duties, what God wanted of Jesus's community. And so, on one level, I see in my own faith tradition the ways that religious others do not have to necessarily be it's not us versus them, that they can actually be living out the way that God wants us to live. So that's one thing. Also, Jesus always stood up for the people who society was mistreating, whether it was prostitutes, that's a common one that comes up. Whether it was people who tax collectors, or people who were carrying out jobs or fulfilling roles in that society that other people weren't happy with, or things like that. So that's a big that's like a very basic foundational part of why Christians want to stand up with people who are marginalized, even if they're not of their own faith community. That's really important. And since the time of Christ, and the 2,000 years since, we have so many other examples and teachings of Catholics who have put everything on the line to help other people. Whether it's an example of a priest who sacrificed himself to save a Jewish family during the Holocaust, or whether it's examples of Catholics who did that in Syria during the war, Catholic priests who stayed.
Do we need to be religious? Do we need to be Catholic or Muslim to do that? I mean,
I don't think so.
Yeah.
No, but I just speak out of my own, my own convictions and experience. And, as someone who holds these faith convictions and believes in a God who is concerned about peace and justice and equality, these are things that my faith community, we feel compelled to do. But I know that people of all religious backgrounds or no religious background also have the same sense of ethical duty of standing up for people, even when it wouldn't have to impact them. They could just sit on the sidelines, but instead they say, no, I'm going to, I'm going to stand up for this person, even though whatever they're facing isn't directly hurting me, and wouldn't if I didn't get involved.
So what would you think that probably Jesus and Muhammad to say to each other if they would ever met?
Oh, goodness. I think this sounds strange maybe, but I think they would laugh a lot. I have a feeling from what I've read about the prophet and about Jesus that they were both pretty lighthearted individuals who were dealing with a lot of really challenging issues in their societies, and really, were persecuted for it, right? But my sense is that both of them had a lightness about them that allowed them to still find joy in whatever circumstance they were dealing with. So I don't know if I can imagine what a conversation would look like, but I just imagine both of them to be kind of joyful, happy people that are able to maintain that amidst all the difficult things that they had to deal with.
Mm-hmm. So, Zahra Islami, what did you like the most from Islam? Can you name a specific thing in Islam that makes you think more about the universal God?
What do I like most? Oh my goodness. I'm a huge fan of art and religious art. I took some of it, as I mentioned to you before we started, I took some of it down off of my bookshelf, but my little office here has tons of religious art. And for me, that's one of the ways that I really connect to God. I really enjoy Arabic calligraphy, and I've tried to learn, not in a professional way by any means, but as a part of my Arabic study, tried to learn how to do the writing In terms of the Muslim conception of God, I really enjoy and appreciate the 99 names of God. I recount a story in the book about sort of feeling comforted by hearing those recited during a difficult time. But what's been most, I think, illuminating for me and interesting is this emphasis on God's rahmah, or God's mercy, or compassion, or beneficence. There's lots of different ways people translate it. But what I really like about that is it resonates a lot with what Pope Francis often talks about. So Pope Francis often talks about God as being merciful, and what he's drawing on there, and also what the Islamic tradition is drawing on, is this maternal quality of God. Oftentimes, especially in the Christian tradition, we think of God as masculine, or we might use masculine pronouns to talk about God. But when we invoke God as merciful, and particularly as Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, the all compassionate, the all merciful, we're invoking this sort of motherly quality. The word raham in Arabic means, the insides, the womb, the intestines, like these familial family connections that people have, and that God has with us. And so when I hear my Muslim friends praying using that language, and when I hear Pope Francis talk about God as being all merciful, that's something that I really cherish, and I find to be a really great point of commonality between the two religious groups.
So what is, from the Muslim perspective, that you would like them to know about Catholicism?
Well, first of all, I will say I think Muslims know a lot more about Christians and about us than we know about Muslims. Simply because, at least in this country, right? Because there's just many more Christians, and the holidays are ubiquitous and all of that. I'm trying to think
about Catholicism. I'm talking
particularly,
about yeah.
So it's hard to pick, because it's such the Catholic tradition is so rich and full of so many things. I guess I would want them to, oh goodness, maybe know more about who Jesus is to us, and why we're able to affirm Jesus as divine in a way that doesn't conflict with a monotheistic view of God.
Tell me. I want to know. I want to know, Jordan. Tell me.
Yes. So it's more complicated than this conversation could that we could do with this conversation. And one of the cop-outs that Catholic priests often use, I think, is that, well, the Trinity is a mystery, so we can never really understand it. Which I agree with. I agree with, but at the same time, I think it leaves something wanting, and people really want to sort of understand what that's all about. So the way I understand it, this idea of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, is that these aren't necessarily three separate deities, and this is what the church teaches. It's not three different gods, but it's rather these relationships in God's self. That sounds sort of weird, but it's that's the way the church has talked about it. So there's a relationality in God. We not only talk about God as Father, Son, and Spirit, but also love, or lover, beloved, and the love between them. So God isn't simply for us this sort of like monad, this singular being by God's self, but there's a communal aspect to who God is. And that's what Christians are talking about when we talk about the Trinity. Now, I will say that a lot of times in our practice and in the way we speak, that doesn't always come through. And indeed, there might be some Christians that when we pray, sometimes we'll pray to Jesus, or sometimes we'll speak of the Holy Spirit, and sometimes we'll pray to God the Father. So that language makes it very confusing. And even Christians themselves might not always get it right. But I also, in my study of Islam, which always needs to expand and grow, and I need to learn more. I at least remember reading something in Ibn Arabi, one of the mystic writers, who had this sort of notion of God as loving, and there kind of being a relationality to it. So I know there's ways that it could resonate with the Islamic tradition, even though it's not something that Muslims are, the Trinity is not something that Muslims want to affirm. So
Yes, I was looking at the next question I have, but okay, here is my challenge. I am not Islam expert. I am not Catholic expert. I just say what I understand about the faith, about my faith, and then I'm going to explain. So in the Islamic tradition, we believe that God spoke to a human directly and through book and through his book, and then that book was Quran. And then we believe that, okay, this is God's words. I mean, God just directly, okay, you get that. And then in the book, it's very apparent that God says Jesus was a very special person. We believe, I mean, this is this belief that Jesus was special, not unlike any human, unlike anything on this planet, special. And then we believe that from the get-go, I mean, his birth was a miracle, his existence was miracle, everything about him was miracle. But it's in the book says very specifically that he was like the one of God's creation. And then when we say just again too much, I have never seen anyone to explain the Trinity in a way that makes sense to me, as I believe God is one. Yeah. And I think that's sort of misunderstanding.
And it's okay for us to disagree too. I think that's part of it too. I had the great privilege this past semester of sitting in on a course about early Christian history and the formation of early Christian doctrine with some of my Muslim friends and colleagues in the program. And it was, I so valued the questions that they would ask, because they're not questions that I would ask necessarily, because it's second nature to me, or I'm just
saturated. Yeah, the mind saturated by what we know. Okay, so Parisa says looking for ways to unify us rather than separate us. So you are talking about getting together, having dialogue, and unifying, having unifying moments. I think. I think in our yesterday in our discussion, I just asked you if you could share with us the call of action that you think from the Muslims part they need to do, and from the Catholic sides they need to do. But very quickly before we go, that I know that I'm just taking too much time, but what is the main difference between Catholicism and Christianity?
So Catholicism, we would consider a denomination or a branch of Christianity. Catholics would oftentimes consider themselves the sort of original, along with Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox Christians. We trace our lineage all the way back to the earliest, the early church. Within the Protestant Reformation happening in the 1500s, and most Protestant denominations identifying sort of with that split, which Catholics were not a part of.
Do we have more Catholic, or do we have more Christians? I think we have more Christians.
So I'll say, first of all, that Christian is the broadest umbrella category, right? So like a Catholic would consider themselves a Christian. There are more Catholics in the world than all the other Christians. So Catholics are the largest denomination. Actually, Catholics and Muslims globally are are about equal. So I think there's close to 2 billion Catholics and Muslims, I think. I think.
There is 1.3 billion, but I'm thinking maybe it's like Sunnis and Shias. So we have Sunnis, so many Sunnis, and then Shia is just a very smaller part. So I just very quickly, and then we are going to go to the call on action. So what do you think Muslim people need to work on themselves if you feel they have kind of weakness? Yeah, okay. So call on action. I think that addresses this question. So what is the call on action that we need to do for better understanding?
So I have a few things. The first is I encourage everyone to follow more people on social media who don't share their religious or national background. I think for me, one of the most fruitful, it's a very fruitful way to get to know people's, the way that religion plays out in people's lives. Just during this past month of Ramadan, for my Muslim friends, they're posting all about if the virtual iftars that they're doing, or the ways that they miss Taraweeh prayers, or all these different ways that they're living out their religious lives during COVID-19. And so, especially during a time like this, when we can't be together in person, connecting over social media is a really great way for us to not only have conversations, but also to just kind of witness and see how other people live out their lives and what their relationship with God looks like. I think a couple other things. It's important that we let religious others speak for themselves. This is more of a philosophical point, I guess. But rather than listening to people who maybe have a bone to pick with a particular religious community, and who want to define them in a certain negative way, we have to go to the source, and we have to say, who are you and what is your religion about for you? Because I think sometimes when we don't hear it from the people that hold these convictions, we can be led astray. I think when we're talking about comparing different religious groups, and this gets to the point that we made earlier, we have to compare apples to apples, not apples to oranges. And what I mean by that is we shouldn't compare the best in our own tradition or an idealized version of ourselves with the worst possible image that we have of Muslims or whoever the other is. I'm not going, it's not fair for me, for example, to compare Mother Teresa to an ISIS fighter in Syria or Iraq, or to say that Christianity is defined by Mother Teresa and that Islam is defined by ISIS. That's not a fair sort of comparison. As I mentioned earlier, also, I think it's important for us to actively learn what the stereotypes and generalizations are that exist about different communities, and then confront them and wrestle with them in ourselves. I think we're only really able to push for change beyond ourselves once we begin to do that internal work in our minds and in our hearts. And then I think lastly, we need to stand up for each other. We need to stand with each other. And not just in times of crisis, like COVID-19, for example, or after some sort of a hate crime, but in the long game. One of the things that has been really beautiful for me to see are just the longstanding interfaith relationships that people have with one another. I just today got an email from a Catholic woman and a Muslim woman in, I think it was in Minnesota. I'll have to go back and check, but they emailed me to let me know that they'd read my book, but more importantly, to tell me that that they had been friends for 30 years and had spent so much time together, and just were living in solidarity and living what we call the dialogue of life. And I think that's the most important thing, is to live out this everyday sort of dialogue that doesn't need to be scheduled on the calendar, that we don't have to fit in amid all of our other activities, but simply being present to those around us and walking with them in an open and in a charitable way.
Excellent. So this is Jordan's book, if I can, yes, Finding Jesus Among Muslims, How Loving Islam Makes Me a Better Catholic. Excellent. Thank you so much, Jordan. You shared tremendous amount of knowledge and information with me. Really appreciate it. At the end of the program, I ask my guests to close the program with something meaningful about peace and about kindness and compassion. And I would like you to do so.
Sure. So I'm going to read a brief prayer that I wrote in the back of my book. It's a joint prayer for Christians and Muslims, but I think many people could pray this prayer together. It's meant for interreligious prayer settings or other things like that. It goes like this. Merciful and compassionate God, who created humanity in unity and in diversity, help us to be peacemakers and inspire us to repel evil with good. Help us to love our neighbors, to welcome the stranger, and to turn enemies into friends. Guide us as one community as we strive on the path of justice, peace, and understanding. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Jordan. So stay with me for a second. You are watching To Peace Mindedly, a podcast show where I feature peaceful bridge makers. The edited version of this conversation is going to be available, the audio version available on Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, and 3 other podcast platforms. So you're more than welcome to listen to Jordan later on your leisure time. And then here I was just talking with this young scholar who taught me so many things about the things that I didn't know. Thank you so much. And with that said, thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.
Sure.